Well, thank you everyone for coming along to this Bright Blue event hosted in partnership with Trade Unionists for Safe Nuclear Energy. Our event is titled, Can the UK Achieve Net Zero Without Nuclear? My name is Patrick Hall. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at Bright Blue and I will be chairing today's discussion. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into things. If you would like to tweet about this event, you can do so using the hashtags BrightBlue and CPC21 or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @WeAreBrightBlue. If you wish to ask a question, if you could just refrain from asking your question until one of the roaming microphones is handed to you. The reason being is that as well as us in this room, we also have a virtual audience watching through the camera at the back there. So they won't be able to hear your question unless you speak into the microphone. So it just provides them with a bit of context for when the panel answers your questions. So that would be great if you could wait for the roaming mics. It's quite a timely discussion we're having because recently we've seen the energy debate heat up, rising gas prices, renewables outputs down, nuclear reactors offline, an interconnector between France and Britain on fire. The need for increased energy between now and 2050 is great. If you think about the transition, we need to have more electric vehicles. The way we heat our homes is quite possibly going to rely on heat pumps. And also in terms of our heavy industry, such as electric arc furnaces for steel production. So it is a really salient debate at the moment. And of course, nuclear is a form of low carbon energy, but its role in the UK's future energy mix is one that is somewhat contested. So I'm sure we will have a great discussion about that today. So the key questions that we're asking is, how critical is nuclear energy to delivering net zero? How can the nuclear industry play a role in levelling up Britain? Is there a labour skills shortage in the nuclear industry? And if so, how can this be rectified? How can nuclear help Britain build back better from COVID? What is holding nuclear back? What policies are needed from government to scale up nuclear energy? When are nuclear technologies such as small modular reactors and nuclear fusion likely to be rolled out across Britain? And what role can nuclear play in ensuring energy security? So we have our fantastic panel here to answer those questions. We have with us Trudy Harrison. Trudy is Parliamentary Undersecretary at the Department for Transport and the MP for Copeland. Julia Pyke is with us. Julia is the Director of Financing for Sizewell C at EDF. Rachel Morison is the Energy Climate Utilities Reporter at Bloomberg. And Professor Robin Grimes is currently Professor of Materials Physics at Imperial College. And Sue Ferns is the Deputy General Secretary of Prospect. Sue has been elected as the new Trade Union Congress President. So thank you very much to all of our speakers. I'll hand over now for your introductory remarks and I'll go to you first, Trudy.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you, Tusney, for support since becoming an MP, but far more importantly, the support that the unions in particular have provided to my community of Copeland, the centre of nuclear excellence and very much the birthplace of the atomic energy industry. Whilst I am the Parliamentary Undersecretary for the Department of Transport, far more importantly, I'm born and raised West Cumbrian from Copeland, brought up in Seascale, which is the closest village to Sellafield, and have many close personal ties with the industry, not least because my father, brother, daughters, aunties, uncles, cousins and myself have all worked at Sellafield and continue to work. My husband is a nuclear welder with 42 years experience. I thought I knew a thing about welding, thing or two about welding when I tried the Sizewell C MIG test, but at 75%, I don't think I'd survive the bombers, and I certainly wouldn't do my husband proud. Anyway, the question, does nuclear play a part in net zero? I think I would refer to a quote which goes something along the lines of, nuclear is the only proven energy source that can reliably deliver power day and night through any season, almost anywhere on Earth, that has been proven to work at a large scale. That's Bill Gates, page 84, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And actually, I think over recent weeks in particular, we have seen a constant and very positive drumbeat for the nuclear industry. Environmentally, if we're going to reduce our emissions from 1990 levels by 78%. It's absolutely critical. The Climate and Carbon Budget 6, the Committee at Climate Change have stated around 10 gigawatts will be required, but we're going to lose about 6.5 gigawatts when the AGR reactor fleet comes offline at Heysham, Hartlepool, Hinckley, Hunterston, Torness, Dungeness. And so with only Sizewell B online for the next decade or so, and Hinckley coming online in the next few years, there's a massive need to ramp up the energy provision. And the three asks that we put forward when we co-founded the roadmap to net zero were around securing that financial model, a regulated asset base for Sizewell C, also the commitment to small modular reactors, and to really support the private sector coming on board, for government to set out the confidence that we have in the nuclear industry. So that the energy, the 10-point plan, the Green Industrial 10-point plan that the Prime Minister set out, point 3 was the commitment to small modular reactors, advanced modular reactors and gigawatt plus reactors, which was superb to have. But going forward, it really is that commitment towards the financial policy and also strong statements from my colleagues across government to provide the confidence to the private sector that nuclear will continue to be invested upon and will be very much part of our energy mix going forward. And then thinking about transport, 1 in 7 cars, new cars now sold, is an electric vehicle. Our plan is to ban the sale of petrol and diesel cars from 2030, and that from 2035, all new cars would be zero emission at the tailpipe, which I always used to call an exhaust. That doesn't mean that we're going to ban the combustion engine, but it does mean that we won't have vehicles that emit harmful gases. And that leads us to the fuel provision of things like hydrogen and synthetic fuels, and that's very much where I see nuclear playing an even greater part as we decarbonise the transport sector. That's just road vehicles. We've got maritime, we've got aviation. All of this needs a reliable either electrolysis through electrification or other provision, possibly using heat and steam from nuclear power stations, as well as renewable energy as well. So all in all, I cannot see how we can possibly do net zero without nuclear if we're going to also support the economy, level up the country and achieve all of government's objectives. And I'm delighted about that because I am the greatest champion of the nuclear industry, and I very much value the jobs, the apprenticeships, the communities, the nature actually that we see on the SSSI sites around nuclear power stations around the UK, and the high quality, high value GVA that the nuclear industry brings to all of the communities that I think are waxing lyrical about their support for that industry.
Thank you, Trudy. You mentioned SMRs. We've heard that SMRs are just around the corner for quite some time now. When do you realistically expect to see that technology being rolled out?
Well, as far as I'm aware, Rolls-Royce in particular have a 470 megawatt design that they would like to put through the generic design assessment process under the Office of Nuclear Regulation. They're awaiting sign-off on around about £210 million. Already have private sector funding very much in place, but clearly they need government to agree to that 210, which we're very, very close to sign-off, I understand. But then they'll go through the GDA. But I also know that Rolls-Royce aren't looking to follow a linear kind of critical path. When that happens, we will also look at manufacturing sites and the civils, so that hopefully in 5 years, when it comes out of GDA, we're hitting the ground running with the manufacturing sites, hopefully with the orders, not just for the UK, but across the globe as well. Because I also think it's going to be the best way to help developing countries get the energy that they need without the reliance on fossil fuels.
Thank you, Trudy. Julia, I'm going to hand over to you for your introductory remarks.
Thanks. Well, obviously I agree with everything Trudy said. I'm not going to repeat it. So the points I would add are that nuclear is actually really important to making net zero affordable for consumers. Sort of counterintuitively, people think that nuclear is very expensive and it does have a high capital cost, but it will bring down consumer bills. And that's because, as we've all seen from recent weeks, you can have very considerable periods of low wind. There isn't affordable battery storage available. Maybe it will come along, and if it does come along, that's a great thing. Nuclear is never competing with other technologies. We need everything that we can get to help us reach net zero. But Bayes modelling shows that nuclear will actually bring down consumer bills. So Trudy mentioned nature. As we look at making all of our electricity from low carbon sources, it's really important that we actually look at the size of the land take of making energy. We also obviously need food for land for agriculture, and we need land for nature. So Sizewell C, which would make around about 6 to 7% of the UK's current electricity demand, will take around 33 hectares. The operational site, if you wanted to make that energy from solar, it would take around 30,000. If you wanted to make that energy from onshore wind, it would take around 90,000. That's not to say that we don't want solar. We do, it's great. It's not to say we don't want onshore wind. We do, it's great. But it's to say that you've got to take all of these things into account when you're planning your energy mix, and you need some things which have a small, dense footprint, make a lot of electricity from a small place. I'd also like to mention the opportunities to fit nuclear into the increasingly intermittent system. So we see that the system will be dominated by renewables, and that nuclear will need to work with those renewables. One of the ways in which we'll do that is by releasing heat from Sizewell C. So before it hits the turbines, we'll have a valve to release heat. And with that heat, around about 400 megawatt thermal of heat is sort of almost free because it doesn't impact electrical output, and then it becomes a choice as to how much heat you release, dependent obviously on having made the relevant safety case. And you essentially get around 4 units of heat and lose 1 unit of electricity. So that becomes a choice about what does a nation want more. Does it want low carbon heat, or does it want electricity? With the heat, you can do things like heat assisted hydrogen, which there's a really great project in Germany making hydrogen around about 10% more efficiently than green electrolysis hydrogen. We've got a really exciting project which we could power a direct air capture technology, which is heat based. So it would be hugely cheaper than the figures you'll have seen in the press recently about the Climeworks technologies, which are all based on electricity. To power big fans, this would be convection based and use the heat. And we can also looking very closely at non-grid uses of electricity. So Sizewell C is in a very arid county. It may very well be that over the next decades, what Suffolk really wants is a lot of electricity using for desalination. And again, we can fit both electrolysis of hydrogen and powering a desalination plant in on days when the grid doesn't need as much electricity as Sizewell will produce. Trudy mentioned jobs and levelling up. Nuclear is a fantastic jobs machine, and it doesn't just create jobs, it creates careers. So Stuart Crooks, who runs Hinkley Point C, started as a 16-year-old apprentice. The people who run Sizewell B started as apprentices. We have a fantastic track record of taking people in as apprentices and turning them out at the top of the companies. And that is a track record of which we're really proud, and we should probably make more. And then finally, we need the RAB. And we need the RAB because we need nuclear to become investable for pension funds. We need to be able, as a nation, to size the nuclear fleet according to our need, and not to have to engage too much in geopolitics in order to get nuclear. So nuclear, under the regulated asset-based model, will offer long-term UK inflation-linked financial investment opportunities, and it makes a really nice virtuous circle that UK pensioners will be benefiting from a huge investment in energy for our children and our children's children, and indeed for them to have jobs and careers. So personally, I'm in favour of nuclear of all technologies. I think there's not a competition between nuclear and renewables. There's also not a competition between different forms of nuclear. It's important to acknowledge that it does take some time to get things licensed, and that in order to keep the industry alive and moving on with the great progress we see at Hinkley between Units 1 and Unit 2, we really need to get on with Sizewell, and I know we have Trudy's support in that agenda. And my ask of government is to let us start building.
Thank you very much, Julia. Rachel, I'm going to hand over to you for your introductory remarks.
Thank you. Yes, I cover energy and climate at Bloomberg, and that really means anything to do with the energy transition. And I guess this is the age of electricity, the age of the electron, and talking about the power mix going forward as demand increases is taking up a lot of everyone's time at the moment. I was planning to talk about the crossroads that nuclear seems to be stuck at in Britain, but I think the situation changed somewhat in the last 24 hours. The pledge yesterday by the Prime Minister to make electricity supply fossil fuel free by 2035 puts nuclear at the centre of the energy system. And the UK needs to find a way to get off gas, and the plan seems to be for nuclear to be there to provide low carbon power when the wind's not blowing. This was a strong signal from government of its support for the sector, and the Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, said that home-generated nuclear was a way to create energy independence and reduce reliance on volatile gas. And one of the things that the energy crunch that we're having at the moment has highlighted has been that there is an issue with not having enough storage or ways to back up offshore wind, in particular when the wind's not blowing. We know the wind doesn't blow all the time. We should be able to plan for it, and that there isn't enough capacity at the moment. That said, 5 of the nation's 8 nuclear power stations are going to be closed by 2024. The next project, Hinkley, won't be generating till 2026, and beyond that, it's not totally clear. So the sector has seen projects come and go. Hitachi's nuclear plant at Wilfer was dropped after the government's most generous financing deal that they'd made wasn't enough. The site has come back into focus with proposals for large-scale Westinghouse AP1000 reactor project and a hybrid small modular reactor and wind farm project led by Shearwater. So the government and Treasury are considering these proposals, and also the Rolls-Royce project that we just heard about. So the government has said that it would mobilise investment for at least one large-scale reactor. There was a story yesterday that said it might be 2. We checked, it's still 1. That looks likely to be Sizewell C. And it's great that we have Julia here to talk about that, so I'll leave that to her. And she mentioned the RAB model plans for that. The legislation will be brought forward. And I do take on board the point that nuclear brings down the cost of energy, but it's clear that the most difficult challenge that the sector faces is financing the capex. It is high, it is a lot of money, and it's difficult for government to commit to that in the right way. How to combine corporate investment, state support, and capital markets. At a conference I was at last week, a speaker from government described the Sizewell negotiations as trying to find that biting point for risk sharing between EDF, the taxpayer via the RAB model, and the final consumer via the CFD. And I think this is a really interesting time to be talking about nuclear. And so on that note, I'll stop and look forward to talking a bit more about it in the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Some interesting points there around the lack of storage for gas and electricity and around the RAD model. I'm sure we'll come to that to talk a little bit more in the Q&A. But for now, I'll hand over to you, Robin.
Well, Patrick, thank you very much indeed. So I thought I'm the techie here today, as it were, and however, I think actually the 3 previous speakers have all covered a lot of that technological challenge really well. So I'm going to emphasise just one part of that, and part of that I'm going to be able to build upon their comments is associated with nuclear cogeneration. Now, actually, there's been a Royal Society report on nuclear cogeneration, civil energy in a low-carbon future. So if you all go to Google, I probably shouldn't have mentioned Google, should I? And you put in Royal Society and cogeneration, you'll find a very long report to read, and I'll be taking questions on that another time, I think. So the question is, the first question is, how crucial is nuclear in delivering net zero by 2050? And the thing is, there are lots of ways in which you can deliver net zero by 2050. And nuclear can be part of many of them, but it doesn't have to be part of all of them. I think a better question is, how crucial is nuclear to delivering a robust, reliable, and dependable generating capacity for net zero? And in that particular case, and again, building on all these other comments, it's all about ensuring that you have a reliable source of electricity. And just remember how much more electricity we're going to need going forward when all of those vehicles are now electric, when the wind doesn't blow, and when it's nighttime. And that's a real challenge, because you can store energy for a short period of time, But trying to store energy for a long period of time is extraordinarily expensive and difficult. The thing with nuclear that you can do is this idea of using it for generating electricity when the demand for electricity is high, but then using that heat, which you've again heard about already, for doing interesting other things, for doing other interesting chemistry, which you can produce hydrogen, you can produce green synthetic fuels that you can then use in aircraft, for example, producing ammonia that you will then use for agricultural purposes, for example. All of those other things you can do with nuclear. And one of the other questions was around SMRs. And I thought I wanted to put that sort of issue of small modular reactors in context, because small modular reactors to us means using a very similar technology, pressurized water technology, that we've seen and that we will be building going forward in some of the larger reactors. But there's an option to use advanced modular reactors at much higher temperatures. And with those higher temperatures, you can do more of that interesting chemistry when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, to create these other fuel types that you need. So look out for that term, advanced modular reactors. And getting ready with those high temperatures, because you also asked about fusion, it helps us get ready for the very high temperature output that are fusion reactors, which is some way into the future. The last question that I thought I would perhaps have a look at today was in terms of the suitably qualified and experienced people. So here's another acronym to add to the litany of acronyms, SQUEB. So we have great people in the UK, a great resource in nuclear already. We've been at this for a very long time. So going forward, unlike many other countries, we do have those people that we need. We're a bit fragile in some of the areas, and we're only going to have it for a while, but we do have that. So I would argue let's get on with this. Let's employ those people and their talents in order to give us that low energy, low carbon generating future.
Thank you, Robin. And Sue.
Thank you. So for those of you who don't know, Prospect is a politically independent trade union representing skilled professional managerial staff across key sectors of the economy. And in nuclear, we represent many thousands of workers, not only in generation, but in decommissioning, R&D, and in regulation as well. And as a union, we have a long-standing commitment to a balanced energy policy, and are pleased to see the growing share that renewables is taking in our energy mix. It's clear, isn't it, that in the current energy crisis that we're in, we are starting to see a better mood music around new nuclear. We are, I think, at a particular moment in time with a focus on net zero pre the COP26 conference, and increasingly there is less dissent that the climate crisis is the greatest issue we face as a society. So I think we all will the end to a net zero 2050. But we now need to focus on the means in order to achieve those ends. And I want to argue that that needs an active industrial policy backed by a long-term skills strategy. Trudy's already referred to the Committee on Climate Change Balanced Pathway, which sees a key role for nuclear moving forward. And the Energy Systems Catapult has said that 10 gigawatts is a no regrets scenario for nuclear. So like other speakers, I think it is important to recognise that nuclear has a key role in closing the energy gap. We have seen unprecedented volatility in the UK's electricity system, real-time prices reaching a high of as much as £4,000 per megawatt hour last winter, but also more recently in the late summer. And we have declining firm power capacity in the UK, leading to an increased reliance on imports and variable power sources, which does undermine risking our energy security and climate goals over the next decade. And I was very interested to see that in his interview with Conservative Home last week, Kwasi Kwarteng referred to nuclear as the key missing piece of the puzzle in terms of energy security. And as Trudy said, nuclear is the only proven low-carbon firm power source that can ensure that resilience without raising emissions, even during extreme weather events. So I think there is a compelling case here. But of course, it's also critical that we look at the economic and jobs impact, because we will only move to net zero with societal consent. And it's important to emphasise, I think, that the UK civil nuclear industry currently sustains tens of thousands of UK jobs, and in fact that each installed megawatt of nuclear capacity supports 4.68 direct and supply chain jobs, which is more than any of the other low-carbon technologies. And of course there is a strong regional dimension to the UK civil nuclear industry. Close to 2/3 of the jobs located either in the northwest or the southwest, where the industry is estimated to contribute £1 in every 50 of economic output in these regions. And those figures, by the way, only capture the benefits related to nuclear power generation. And there's some research by Oxford Economics which shows the wider nuclear industry, including decommissioning and R&D, supports around an additional 60,000 direct jobs and a further 80,000 jobs in the wider economy. And I note, Trudy, that in your constituency there are over 13,000 nuclear workers contributing around 141 million to the local economy. So obviously a huge contribution there. And importantly, from my perspective, these are good quality jobs and they make a really important contribution to the levelling up agenda. I want to say a word before finishing about Springfields, the UK's unique nuclear fuel manufacturing facility, located just outside Preston, employs 800 people directly and indirectly a further 2,000 of them. The nuclear sector deal recognised that Springfields was a unique facility, a unique national facility. But we do need to focus on the fact that the early closure of the AGR stations creates somewhat of a crisis for Springfields, because it takes away a key part of their work programme. And this is creating great uncertainty and concern on site. Why is it doing that? Because it's not just about manufacturing fuel. It's very clear that Springfields plays a key part in the wider nuclear capacity of the UK, employs very highly skilled people, and it's a success story. This is not a case of bailing out an industry failure. It's a success story with that happens to need some short-term support while the AGR fuel orders are lower than they were expected to be. And this issue of skills is vital. I think it's been alluded to already. We have great nuclear skills in the UK, but we need a decision on Sizewell so that those skills can transfer across from Hinckley to Sizewell. We need support for Springfields in order to maintain that critical capacity. And for anybody who may think this is trade union special pleading, let me just say there is a cross-party consensus on this. And we have had some fantastic support from Conservative MPs, especially Mark Menzies, who's been working very closely with us and other stakeholders. Now, colleagues have said that there is support from government. The Secretary of State has said he thinks nuclear is the answer. We agree with all of that, but we've got to move beyond the 10-point plan to a net zero strategy that sets out the road to implementation. We need decisions now. We need decisions urgently, and we need to go further and faster than has currently been mooted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue. I will open the floor for questions in a minute, but I just wanted to abuse my position as chair to pick up on something you said, Julia, in your opening remarks. You said that you don't believe nuclear is competing with other energy sources. But there are others that don't share your views, and critics of nuclear say that it's expensive, and that a decentralised system that is reliant on renewables, interconnectors to Europe, storage and smart devices is preferable. What would you say to that?
I would have said that we don't have the technology today to move to that sort of system. So we can see what we actually do when we have very low wind, and that's burn an awful lot of gas and turn on the coal stations. That's what we actually do. So can you afford to make policy based on things which you hope will come along in the future to rescue you from burning the gas and coal? That's a brave move, I would suggest. The second thing is that the cost of that system are high. The reason that the government is now supporting nuclear is because all of its modelling shows that the system will be cheaper for consumers. So, I mean, of course, people who don't support nuclear are always going to say that this isn't the case. But the Bayes modelling team, who are technology agnostic, have modelled all sorts of different options for systems, and the system with a reasonable amount of nuclear in it simply is cheaper for consumers, as well as giving us energy independence, which is really important, and arriving at net zero with an awful lot of jobs contribution to levelling up and to society.
Thank you, Julia. So does anybody have any questions? Yes, at the back there, if you could just wait for the microphone to come.
Thank you. My name's Olivia. I'm the environment correspondent at the Telegraph newspaper. I have obviously a particular mind to public perception, and I think nuclear has a very specific public perception issue with people's anxiety about accidents, for example, and also things like more mundane things like storage. Are there ways in which the panel thinks that those concerns can be overcome? Are there strategies, are there communication things that haven't been tried yet that could potentially overcome that issue? Thanks.
Trudy, I might go to you first on that.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, actually, because I think it's absolutely right that we tackle the three big elephants in the nuclear room, which are what do we do with the waste, the cost of nuclear, and also the safety record. But rather than coming out with communications plans or strategies, I think it's just actually about getting on and doing it. So storage, we've got the geological disposal facility team looking for sites around the country. They're certainly active in my area because we at Sellafield safely store the vast majority of fissile material. And we've been doing that for decades. We do it very well. We're delighted to do it because it also provides a really good income for our community. And most importantly, it's done safely. I think there's also something to be said for the fact that the so-called waste actually could and should perhaps be an asset, because the reason people are concerned about it is because of its energetic potential. It's still got many, many decades of life left in it, potentially to fuel advanced modular reactors of the future. And I'm delighted that we've got the National Nuclear Laboratory in Copeland as well, who are actively looking at ways in which to use plutonium and other fissile materials of the future. So that's kind of the storage aspect. We do it safely, we do it sustainably in the medium term, and we've got a plan for the long term. I think on cost, nuclear will never be cheap, but it could be so much better value with better financing. The reason that we have the high paid jobs, the qualifications, the skills and the communities that benefit is because of the money that's pumped into the sector, but that's because it's the smallest land take for the greatest energy output. And it's reliable day after day, season after season, decade after decade. And then I think on the safety level, we hear about Fukushima, Chernobyl, but actually, whilst the sensational headlines are toxic, the reality behind the headlines is that nuclear is inherently safe. Anybody that's ever worked on a nuclear power station will know the almost inertia of the permit office, the regulatory process in which we operate nuclear power stations is incredibly safe. Quite right too. That's why countries from all around the world want to put reactors through our generic design assessment, because we are the gold standard for safety, but also security and safeguarding of fissile material. Quite right too. We'll continue to do it.
Rachel, you work in the media, you're a journalist. Public perception is a big part of what you do in communicating to the public. Do you think that the media has a responsibility around this and to avoid sensationalism, referring back to incidents like Trudy just mentioned, Fukushima, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island? Do you think that journalists have responsibility to report on nuclear energy in a way that isn't sensationalised?
I think Fukushima was pretty serious. I don't think it was sensationalised. I mean, it did cause Germany to turn away from nuclear. So compared to that, I don't think the UK has a public perception problem in the same way as a country like Germany, where they just, they'd rather burn coal than have nuclear. But yeah, I suppose the responsibility is not to panic people unnecessarily about technologies, and I don't think, well, Bloomberg definitely doesn't. I don't think I read a lot of stories about scaremongering about nuclear particularly. That's part of what happens when you have a history of a technology. We have communities that are used to nuclear, that are okay with it, have lived there for a long time, and that public acceptance in those areas is crucial to building more. And also when you look at SMRs and I guess advanced modular reactors as well, they will be built on decommissioned sites where communities are already used to the idea of nuclear. So I sort of dispute the idea that the UK isn't open to nuclear. I think people seem to be. To me, it just comes down to whether they want to pay for it.
Do you think that people, though, are aware of how much more dangerous alternatives, like you mentioned, coal are? I recall reading quite a morbid statistic. I think it said that per megawatt hour, coal was 820 times more deadly in terms of the deaths that it causes, predominantly through air pollution. Do you think that the public are aware of this, that if we're turning off the nuclear plants, that we're going to go to coal, like we've seen in Germany?
I guess there's always a danger that we live in an echo chamber and you think, of course everybody knows this. They know that coal does this to the air and does this to your lungs, but perhaps they don't. I think that the awareness of that is increasing. I mean, there's so much communication about climate change now around COP, but also Extinction Rebellion. There's a lot in the media on this issue, and I feel like people know the most they've ever known. They could definitely know more about it, but hopefully with electric vehicles and smart devices coming into the home, people are going to get a bit more interested in this. And we already see that wanting a green supply of energy to your home is really important for people. So that obviously is something that's coming into their consciousness. How green is my energy? How low carbon is it?
Thank you. Did anybody else want to come in on that point? Sue?
Yeah, just briefly, if I may. On the issue of safety, clearly there have been some big major incidents outside of the UK. But I think it is important to recognise that every energy source, every energy system needs to be managed safely. If we look at renewables, for example, at offshore wind at the moment, it has a worse safety record than the oil and gas sector had. It has a worse safety record than nuclear. And I do think sometimes people assume that green means good in all aspects, and it isn't unless it's managed properly. You need to put it into perspective. And I think anybody who's ever visited a nuclear power station will know and be aware and be impressed by the safety culture that exists on all of those stations. In terms of cost, look, what's always quoted is the megawatt hour price of electricity at Hinkley, which is high. Just put it in perspective, when renewables, offshore wind was at a similar stage of development, we had megawatt hour deals at £120, which is higher than Hinkley. But nobody's arguing that that's the right way to build our future nuclear stations. And we have to look at the cost of capital. As trade unions, we have said that RAB would be a better option because it could reduce costs by up to 50%. But actually, I'm agnostic about it. As long as you take the risk out of it, it will reduce the cost, and that's what we need to do.
Could I just add one thing, which is I think that public opinion in the UK isn't actually really averse to nuclear. The public opinion is pretty stable. We do a lot of polling. It's generally speaking around a third. So a third of people are enthusiastic, a third of people are not enthusiastic, and a third of people are not very interested. But most people have not historically been that interested in where their electricity is coming from, so that's not really surprising. And I think going to your question to Rachel, Patrick, I do think the media has a role in helping people better understand. There are some pretty basic stats. Anyone who actually Googles safety of electricity sources can see that nuclear is the safest way of making electricity. And help people understand the relationship between the way your electricity is made, whether or not you're going to build more nuclear, and whether or not you're going to have decent air quality. There was an article in The Economist, I think one last year at some point, which said that if we'd built out nuclear worldwide, as had been proposed before Chernobyl, we actually wouldn't have climate change. You think how many millions of people are now suffering as a result of climate change? How many millions of people are actually going to lose their lives as a result of climate change? It's tragic. And this sort of public attitude, the perception of the commentariat that the public don't like nuclear is in itself a big problem.
Thank you, Julia. Robin, I know that you want to come in.
Yeah, I think Julia's quite right. I mean, one of the ways to absolutely convince people that we're nervous about nuclear is to keep telling them how safe it is. So that there is a lot of subtlety here that we need to get our heads around and understand how to talk about nuclear and to normalise that conversation. The other thing with the economics is it's very difficult, and we're not very good at thinking about it within a systems approach. So, with the new nuclear cogeneration stuff that I mentioned, it isn't just about the cost of the nuclear per kilowatt hour, but it's how and when you can use it for making a difference. It's also about, and we heard about Springfields, for example. It's about that wider context. It's about the nuclear engineering supply chain that we would develop in the UK and the jobs that get created as a consequence of that. So I think when we look to the future of nuclear, we need to look at what else that nuclear brings, and in particular, what jobs that it will bring to us, including at Springfields.
Thank you, Robin. I know that this gentleman at the front here had a question. If you could just wait for the roaming mic.
Thank you. In a technology sense, 30 years off till net zero is quite a long time, given the kind of acceleration of modern technologies to some extent. What do the panel think are the main green tech risks moving forward? I mean, Robin mentioned the F word, fusion. There seems to be a lot of chatter more recently about breakthroughs in fusion, or is it still 20 years off and always will be, the old joke? And also battery storage that Robin mentioned. Is it a case that, we're hearing talk now of putting sugar in lithium-ion batteries and you increase the energy density 5 times, a car could have a range of 1,000 miles. It's not going to drive that, so use your car as your home storage. So are there any kind of green tech risk that's really changed the picture on energy mix? And secondly, I'm not sure, I've heard a statistic that when you produce centrally and then distribute your energy, you lose about 30% in the distribution system. So does that not mean that by 2050 we need a distributed energy production system, which conveniently marries up very well with levelling up? We can displace it all around the country. So it'd be interesting to hear the panel's view on those 2 points.
Robin, I'll go to you first.
So the battery thing, I think, is very important. There's always going to be a role for batteries, but it's inherently limited by the chemistry that goes on, which means it can only support a certain amount of storage, and that storage is going to have a particular time period. And the problem isn't when perhaps we have a bit of a lull or we have day and night, because you can deal with that. It's when you then have overcast, grey, cold days with no wind for week on week on week. And that's a much more difficult thing to deal with purely from a storage point of view. The old adage, by the way, about fusion being 20 years away, and actually it always used to be 40 years away. So obviously things have improved on that one. But joking apart, the UK has done incredibly well from a manufacturing point of view with fusion. So there is a lot of activities. There is a lot of capability in the UK to deal with many of the different aspects of fusion. And You are right, it's a very demanding technology indeed. It's one of the things that my research is associated with. But we have a wonderful position as a country at the moment, and it would be truly tragic to see us lose that to other countries. So I think it is something that we should continue to invest in. We should continue to look at some of the ways we can use it, those higher, really high temperatures, and develop those additional technologies which will work for fusion and will work for things like AMRs. And I think that's the way to hedge that bet.
Thanks, Robin. Trudy, do you think there's any disruptive green tech in the pipeline between now and 2050?
Yeah, that question was a little bit out of my comfort zone, to be honest, not being a tech person. But I think people, and I think we've seen over the last 18 months or so, how people and the behavioural change has resulted in less movement, different kinds of movement. And that's one of the unknowns that I'm certainly very conscious that I need to understand within the Department for Transport, because I guess we're coming from a starting point and almost an end point of thinking that almost the same transportation will take place with the same people moving to the same places and the same products coming to the same places. We don't really know that. It's very difficult to model it as well, to therefore plan what systems will be required to move people to places. How many journeys are made that people don't want to make or don't need to make. But I also think somewhere like Sweden, 70% of their communities are supported through a district energy system, which reduces quite a lot of the heat losses. That's 70% actually in a rural area and 90% in an urban area. So maybe turning it on its head, it's actually about a more widely distributed system. But with things like hydrogen, we're looking at Sellafield. I've been very public and forthright in hoping that the first Rolls-Royce small modular reactor comes to the Sellafield area to provide for some of the electricity on that site, because its requirement is somewhere in the order of about Carlisle, relatively smallish city. But then if we're also co-generating hydrogen, whether that can go into a kind of a regional network, looking at the NDA train network and also even potentially shipping as well. So that is me, as a local constituency MP, trying to come up with a really closed circle of how we can generate power for a big requirement, industrial requirement, and how we can generate hydrogen or other synthetic fuels for transportation as well. And I would encourage other MPs and other community leaders actually to think in that way, because it really is about resources locally, working with can-do people in our communities as well, to help them become a little bit more educated and be part of this massively positive movement for our country.
Thank you, Trudy. And interesting there, you mentioned district heat networks. Julia, I wonder if you could tell me, how large do district heat networks need to be, or how many houses do they need to heat for them to be economically viable? I imagine if it's just a small amount of houses, then it's going to be very expensive for those households.
I think you need to basically study other countries which have district heat networks. So in Russia, heat is pumped up to around 80 kilometres away from the power station to provide heat for housing. And what is economic will hugely depend on where policy costs sit. So, we've heard that the government's going to start moving policy costs from electricity onto gas. What then becomes economic is a whole different ball game. So I don't think you can really answer it in terms of the physical geography of Sizewell would allow us to district heat Ipswich, for example, if it became economic to retrofit it. But the economics is all around how the government's going to choose where policy costs fall in the future, as between electricity and gas and between power and heat.
I don't know if anybody else wanted to come in on.
Could I just add a bit, because it's also about how our homes are built as well. And if you've got underfloor heating, so the kind of heat at 26 degrees, which is about right for a wet underfloor heating system, that works. But many of our houses are a bit drafty, maybe Georgian, Victorian or later, and they use radiators, which is a relatively small kind of spatial area that you need a higher temperature. I think it's from about 80 degrees that we need out of our system at home. So that makes a big difference as well in how you would have that closed loop system If that's moving at 80 degrees, that's quite a challenge. If it's moving at 26 degrees, it's more doable. So there's that aspect to it as well. But I definitely think there's a role for high temperature reactors, and I'm following closely what Japan are doing at the moment to co-generate with hydrogen and such like.
Can I just add briefly, not so much directly on the technology point, but I think relevant to it. I think we could do more to learn from experience in a behavioural sense. If you look at the smart meter rollout, it didn't achieve what it was supposed to achieve in terms of influencing behaviour. If you look at the Green Homes scheme recently, it didn't achieve what it was set to achieve. And it does seem to me that your greatest disruption impact, not just the technology, but applying the technology, does depend on learning from experience, and it does depend on affordability for householders. I know that's not directly on the technology point, but I think you can have the best technology in the world, but unless it's rolled out properly and people can afford it, then it won't have the impact it should have.
Are there any...
Sorry, I was going to say, on the
go ahead.
technology point, I think you're absolutely right that there will undoubtedly be something that comes along and disrupts everything. I've seen models by Bloomberg NEF that leave a gap for technology X, and that's where investor capital is going. That's what people are chasing, like what is going to come along that changes the models that we can, it may be storage, but at the moment the longest battery duration or the average is 4 hours, which doesn't help when you have no wind for 19 days. So hydrogen, we've mentioned, is one that, there's lots of money and attention going into, but it could be something else. And I think that that's one of the most interesting things. Things move quicker. Technology happens and comes to market a lot faster, and the price can come down as we see the need to decarbonise. So I wouldn't rule out something else. And I think that might be part of what's behind some of the hesitancy of locking in projects for 30 years, because by the time that they are built, the market's changed and the investment doesn't look as smart as it did at this moment.
Are there any further questions from the floor? Well, if not, I will go to a question that we've received online. I'm not being rude by being on my phone. It's where the questions are coming in from. It's submitted anonymously. It's more of a statement than a question, so I might reframe it as a question for the panel to answer. What cautionary tale can we learn from Germany abandoning nuclear and continuing their reliance on coal and Nord Stream 2? Trudy, would you like to go first on that?
It's not even a reliance on coal, it's also a reliance on electricity coming from France, which is nuclear generated predominantly. So yeah, I think big lessons to learn there actually. And I use a thing which I've forgotten the name of, the electricity app, which kind of shows you where the electricity, somebody help me out with the name. Electricity app. It shows you the world and the kind of colours of emissions that are coming from different countries. And Germany's always well below other countries, and it is that reliance on coal, which, we have committed to an end to thermal coal for power stations. Absolutely. And then you look at other countries like France, which have got a much more environmentally sensitive emissions base because, surprise, surprise, let's look at the clues, a big dependence on nuclear.
So it's inevitable then, Rachel, isn't it, that if we don't go to nuclear, we're just going to be stuck with more carbon-intensive forms of energy, and we've seen that take place in Germany, and we've seen that take place, I think, in Japan to a certain extent as well.
Yeah, I guess one of the problems for Germany is something that we've touched on here, was the jobs. So they have a huge industry around lignite mining and whole areas where they depend on those mines for jobs. So it wasn't as easy for politicians to just say, hey, we don't want coal. A bit like we're describing with the nuclear sector, a lot of jobs are tied up with those mines. So I think they have obviously recognised that this isn't sustainable for them to swap, to go for a sort of renewables coal mix. And at one time, Germany was a leader in renewable technology, and they have really lost that position to countries that have been able to get off coal. But in a lot of places we see you get off coal and you use gas. The UK has 38% gas in its electricity mix. So we're not fossil fuel free. We are getting towards being coal free, which is great. But then you have the problem of gas and what do you do with it? And we're seeing at the moment when there is no wind, we've mentioned it, we turn up gas. So the UK, yes, can be pleased that we've got off coal, but we still have a big problem. And that is one of the interesting questions, I think, that, you know, this price crunch where we're seeing eye-wateringly high prices, does that drive policymakers to say, okay, we need to get off fossil fuels completely? That seems to be what the UK government's saying. But then we also have the sort of dual threat of intermittent renewables, and there's no wind, what are we going to do? So it's not easy to find the solution. I do think that at the moment, when we don't have any wind or solar, we are using fossil fuels, and that's a bit like the reality that Julia pointed to. What happens? We use more fossil fuels, but there is at least a recognition now that that shouldn't be always the case, and we need to find a way to get off gas.
Robin, I know you want to come.
And of course, the other thing that we need to bear in mind, it has been mentioned, but I think it stands some really significant emphasis here, is that electricity at the moment is less than a third of our energy use. When we talk about decarbonisation, it's not about decarbonising just the electricity, it's decarbonising the transport, it's decarbonising all our requirements for heat. And that becomes a much, much bigger task ahead of us. So I would argue that, again, you know, storage, and we're worrying about storage for electricity, we need to think about that times 3 or 4. And the other thing is the interconnectors. People have been talking about the interconnectors, and they are going to become important even more than they are now going into the future. But we have to have something to put into that system. It's not all about that interconnectors giving us electricity from other places. We've got to be able to give the electricity back in the other direction as well. And again, nuclear, a big capacity of nuclear constantly producing electricity for us will be important in our part in the interconnectors.
We've got some more questions coming in online here, so I'll just read those out. The first question asks, nuclear takes a long time to build. Will it be too late to meet the new 2035 target? And the second question is, how can we bring down the cost of building nuclear power plants? Julia, I might go to you first.
I think there was an article in the Telegraph last week which said the best time to decide to start building Sizewell C was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. And, you know, of course it takes a long time if you don't decide to get on with it. People talk about Hinkley being late. Hinkley is not late, Hinkley's on time. What took a long time for Hinkley was doing all the paperwork. I did all the law for Hinkley for 10 years. It took 10 years to get a design which was already being built somewhere else through UK approvals and to get all of the paper-based arrangements in place before you could start building. So with Sizewell, will it take longer than one might wish, given the fact that the AGRs are turning off sooner than we'd hoped? Of course it will, but it will take even longer if we don't start. So, this thing around stopping agonising and just making a decision and letting us get on with building it is really important. In terms of what was your second question was about
bringing down the cost.
Bringing down the cost. The way to bring down the cost is to copy. So at Hinkley, you can see that Unit 2 is very considerably faster and therefore will cost less than Unit 1. And that's unsurprising. It's because with Unit 1, you're doing something for the first time in this country. And with Unit 2, you're copying it. So individual elements of it are around sort of 30%, between 30%, and in some cases all the way up to 80% faster and therefore cheaper because time is money when you're building a project. And so the way to bring down the cost of nuclear is to allow us to copy Hinkley, build it at Sizewell as effectively Hinkley Units 3 and 4, taking all of the productivity benefits which are already shown Unit 1 to Unit 2, and that's what will bring the cost down. And that's the same approach that the SMRs want to take, which is build the same thing again, and don't do what we've done historically, which is build multiple different designs, changing them a little bit. All the AGRs are different. Every AGR is a different plant. And that's really silly. You want one operating team across a fleet. You want another fleet of SMRs or AMRs, whatever the government decides to do. And that's what brings costs down.
So a standardised design. Robin,
Yeah,
would you agree with
copying.
that?
Yeah, I mean, it is absolutely fascinating. You look at the Magnox reactors as well, which were the stage before then. Every single one was different. And all the fuel was different for every single one of those as well. But at least with the AGRs, we had the same fuel in all of those reactors. So I think that's true. Get the SMRs and the AMRs, standardise that design, and build them again and again and again. And with the gigawatt reactors as well. We're going to need a lot of capacity. But it's a system of systems, and the same is true for the economics. So if we're at the forefront of building those new technologies, then those companies that will supply as part of the nuclear engineering supply chain will create those jobs. Those jobs will then go to overseas developments and reactor builds out there, and that improves the economics as well. But if we don't get on with it, somebody else will do it instead.
Are there any further questions from our audience? Yes, sir, the gentleman at the front.
So a lot of this argument is predicated on the idea that we're projecting a certain level of demand for energy. Is there any kind of, have any of the panels seen any work where maybe we move to a lower intensity economy? I mean, William Stanley Jevons had this concept of rebound effect. Because my car is now more fuel efficient, I'm going to drive more miles. So we're making progress on reduced energy intensity and therefore greenhouse gas emissions in that energy, but we're all doing more stuff or buying more stuff, i.e. the global economy is still growing arguably beyond its capacity, and so therefore the emissions are still going up. So has there been any kind of work that any of the panel have seen about different trajectories for our demand for energy?
Rachel, I might go to you first. Should we be scaling back our growth?
I guess all I can think of that I've seen is the demand models, which used to be flat to slightly falling until everybody started making net zero commitments. And then you can just see different scales of how steeply the curve goes up. The government says demand is going to double by 2050. I guess also it's difficult over a 30-year horizon to predict a lot of these things. We don't even know how many people are going to use heat pumps versus hydrogen home heating. So there's a lot of assumptions you make when looking at that demand number. But I have to say, mostly everything I've seen shows expectations that demand will increase.
Anyone else want to come in on that point? No.
I would just like to say it's demand in a different way as well, because if we're not going to, we probably need to stop saying that we're not going to have a demand for gas. We're not going to have a demand for gas which is harmful for the environment, but we could utilise the gas network which reaches about 23 million households across the UK with a kind of gas, perhaps hydrogen, with a kind of gas that is not damaging for the environment. And then how do we produce that gas? That might be used in nuclear power stations. It will, I'm sure, be used in renewable generated electricity, and it may be in other forms as well. So it's not just the kind of amounts, it's how the energy in all its forms will be produced. And Robin was quite right to point out the need for transport. Transport's about 27% of all domestic emissions, of which 55% is from cars and taxis, 15% is from heavy goods vehicles, another 15% from buses and that kind of thing, and then you get down to the domestic aviation, domestic maritime. We don't actually measure in that international aviation and international maritime, which would really skew the figures. But if we're going to not use petrol and diesel in cars, that obviously creates a much greater need for electricity. If it's going to go into electric cars, that's absolute common sense. And I can't see a great change, because how much have we enjoyed conference? How good has it been to be in a room with people? And how great has the vaccine rollout been, which has enabled us to do that? So desperate were we for human connection and people to get to places.
It's great not to commute to work. So it works both ways, doesn't it?
Yeah, and as I said earlier, we'll see how that behavioural change really does change, but that creates an energy need in a different way, because people are going to be at home. People will want to be warm, comfortable, and they'll still want to be able to travel We are about transport, not teleport, and getting people to places will be, you know, something we'll want to do, not just on this planet, but that takes us to a whole other level with space travel.
Heating those drafty Victorian houses.
Of which I have one. We're doing all we can at the moment. My husband, as I speak, is, I hope, fixing the central heating system with lots of insulation.
Well, the panels, you've mentioned a lot today around the RAB model. I have another question online here. Julia and Sue, I might come to you on this question. It asks, does a regulated asset-based model see consumers on the hook for cost overruns? Julia, I'll go to you first and then I'll come to you, Sue.
So what I'd say is we need nuclear. That's generally agreed. It's now cross-party consensus. And that we therefore have to identify what's the best way to finance the nuclear. And the National Thought Office didn't like the Hinkley Contract for Difference and said that the government should look at a regulated asset base. So nothing is perfect. How do regulated asset bases work? Why are they able to attract low-cost capital of the sort that pension funds have available? It's because they limit the amount of risk which the pension funds take. So if you think about Hinkley, of the £92.50 strike price, £11 is the cost of construction, the rest is the cost of money. And so while there's a lot of talk about construction cost overrun, you can see that actually it's not the construction cost overrun which is dominant in what consumers pay, it's the cost of money. So getting the cost of money down is absolutely imperative. So yes, the consumer will share, not take, but will share some of the risk of construction, as indeed they do on all of the other, I think, 200 billion of regulated assets that there are in the UK today. So it's part of a well understood system which is understood to deliver good value for money for consumers.
Sue, I don't know if you had anything further to add.
So I agree with all of that. I think the challenge will be doing this at a time when fuel costs are rising anyway, and the price cap will be going up. And people will be looking very closely at their energy bills. So I think there has to be a good explanation, a good communication exercise about this. In fact, lots of us are paying things on our energy bills that are not transparent and not well explained at the moment, and I think we need to do better than that. Two other points. One is, I think actually, in contrast to some other policies, it is right that everybody pays for investment in the future. You can't load all the costs onto future generations, so it's right that they go across the whole consumer base. But you do have to think about fuel poverty and social impact as well.
I don't know if anybody else wanted to come in on those points, or we'll open for, are there any further questions from the floor? Okay, well, I've got one question of my own, and Julia, I appreciate there might be some commercial sensitivities around this, so you don't have to answer if you don't want to. But there's been concerns around Chinese firms being involved in nuclear projects in the UK. CGN's 20% stake in Sizewell, for example. Is it right that Chinese firms should not be involved in such projects? And if so, who should plug that gap? Trudy, I might go to you first.
Well, I did have the joy, actually, thanks to CGN, of visiting the Taishan power station a couple of years ago. And the reason I went there was to see for myself the kind of version of the EPR reactor under construction. And it was thanks to the APPG, which I had that opportunity, which the Nuclear Industry Association supports. The most important thing, if we think about the end game here, it's about having UK energy security and stability, and making sure that that is never compromised. I think what we're probably dealing with is some political tensions as well as some real operational tensions as well. But I had the conversation with Julia last night, and actually the engineers who have been working in the UK on some of our projects have been of the highest quality, great to work with. And if we do look at China, actually, I think they've got about 57 reactors, something like that, being built at the moment. We could learn quite a bit from other countries about how fast, if you really want to do this, and there is a political will, we can build out reactors. So that's a little bit of a fluffy answer for you, no doubt, Patrick. but I definitely want to see UK jobs, UK benefits, UK security and UK stability in our energy sector, however it is determined that we proceed.
Rachel, should we be learning from China, or do you think it's right that we shouldn't have Chinese involvement in our infrastructure projects like this?
I guess the setup of the projects at the beginning was interesting because EDF and CGN were supposed to be learning from one another, sharing the projects, and then Bradwell at the end was going to be the Chinese designed reactor. The political, since Hinckley was announced with, you know, the Chinese president came over and it was all a wonderful UK-China cooperation, the political landscape has changed. I can't imagine that happening with a Sizewell final investment decision, but clearly that 20% stake for construction will need to be replaced. That may be from government, that may be a different structure, but it seems as though the government's quite keen to move the narrative on from should we have Chinese investment, should we not, to we're not having it, let's find another way. From the reporting that we've done, we understand that that isn't going to be a hurdle on either EDF or the government side, that there's still will to get Sizewell agreed. But that said, there's been 10 months of talks and no agreement yet. So obviously this is a bit of a hurdle, a kind of late hurdle. But yeah, we'll have to see. Maybe we can ask Julia.
Julia, do you think it's likely that the government are going to plug that gap and take a 20% stake?
I'm going to take advantage of your kind offer to not ask me the question.
Okay, well, that's fair enough. Robin, did you have anything that you want to come in? Okay, well, if there are no further questions, then I will draw things to a close. So thank you very much. Oh, sorry, this gentleman at the front here. If you just wait for the microphone to come so our virtual audience can hear you.
It's not a question, it's at this juncture and before you close, Patrick, I'd like to thank all the panellists on behalf of TUSNE for the participation and excellent contributions today, and also to Bright Blue for partnering with us on this event. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you very much to our audience for coming today, and to our virtual viewers as well for your questions. Just as a final shameless plug, if you want to become a member of Bright Blue, we're running a party conference special of £10, so you can get lots of free literature in the mail and attend some great events around the country. So if you're interested in signing up, you can speak to Joe in the blue sweater at the back there. But anyway, a round of applause for our excellent panellists.